Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you tonight. Thanks for being here for this Wednesday night Bible study time. We're starting a new study tonight, and I hope it'll be an encouragement and informative. It has to do with a part of the history of God's people in the Old Testament. It has specifically to do with the tribe of Judah that had been carried away into Babylonian captivity. It has to do with their coming back from captivity. And so, as you look at your study guide, if you have one, it's sort of, I think, trying to grab attention. Israel Goes Home is the title of the lesson, and that's what it is. It's the nation. It's actually not Israel. Israel was the northern kingdom. Judah was the southern kingdom, and we're really going to talk about Judah coming home. Israel, the northern tribes, were carried away in captivity, never to return as a collective whole. But in the case of the southern kingdom of Judah, they were carried away into Babylonian captivity, but it had even been prophesied, and we'll talk about it tonight, that they would come back from that captivity, and they did. And so our lesson is going to be in the book of Ezra tonight. In the first couple chapters of Ezra is where we'll be spending the emphasis of our time. The book of Ezra starts out in chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among all you of his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus is named, and the first question we were asked is, who is this guy? Cyrus. Well, Cyrus became king of Persia in 559 BC. It was 20 years later, so he became king. Get that time frame reference again. By the way, we're in a point of history now that's confirmable by secular sources. And we often talk about one of the things that sort of emphasizes or proves the inspiration of the Bible is its historic accuracy. Now, that's not a proof positive. It's not an absolute proof that the Bible's inspired, but it's one of the sort of circumstantial, coincidental kinds of additional proof of the inspiration. If the Bible was off historically, you think, well, how'd that happen? You think if God is inspiring this, he'd at least make it accurate to known history, and he did. And so the accuracy of the Bible to historical events is confirmable and is also sort of a subtle proof that the Bible is inspired. So we know this Cyrus, and we know that he became king of Persia in 559. It was 20 years later when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. All right, now, so think about this time frame. The Babylonians, who was the great king of the Babylonians? Nebuchadnezzar, right? The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Judah and taken them away captive. So they are we often refer to this as Babylonian captivity. But it had been prophesied that they were going to come back. We'll see here in a minute. It was prophesied that 70 years of captivity, after 70 years of captivity, they would return. But during that 70 years, Babylon fell to Persia. So they were carried away by the Babylonians, but the Babylonians themselves were conquered by the Persians, and it was a Persian king, Cyrus, who issued the decree to send the people home to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. All right, now, we already read what his decree was. Go back to Jerusalem, build the temple. Oh, by the way, before we go to that, I'm wondering if you picked up on something. We said Cyrus conquered the Babylonians. Who does the book of Daniel identify as the one who conquered the Babylonians? Look in Daniel chapter 5. This is the reason I bring this up is somebody might throw this up to you as a potential contradiction. But in Daniel chapter 5, you remember Belshazzar had thrown a great drunken orgious feast, and during that feast, in which they were actually drinking out of the vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, remember? And Daniel interpreted the handwriting on the wall. Immediately after he'd interpreted the vision that Belshazzar saw, Daniel 5 verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And it goes on, chapter 6, verse 1, and it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes and so on, Daniel being among them. So wait a minute. Daniel says it was Darius the Mede, who conquered the Babylonians. But in Ezra, we read about Cyrus. Now, there's several explanations of that, and it's not deemed by historical scholars to be a contradiction. There's a couple of easy explanations. One is that there are a number of Bible characters that went by two different names. Even Daniel himself went by two different names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was their Babylonian names. They had Hebrew names. So it's not uncommon for men to be known by two names in this era. Some scholars think that the name Darius was sort of a title worn by Persian kings, sort of like Pharaoh was the name worn by Egyptian kings. It's sort of more than a name, is sort of a title maybe, that Darius was more like a title of the kings of the Medes and Persians. And that may be the case too. But all who have analyzed this, who are a lot more scholarly, suggest that it's not a contradiction, that this is the same man, this is the same individual. So when he came to power, when he conquered the Babylonians and came to power, he issued this decree to send the Jews home. Now, it says it was in his first year. Notice it actually starts out, chapter 1, verse 1, in the first year, Cyrus, king of Persia. And so, as we said, he had already been king over Persia for 20 years. But this is the first year of his involvement with the Jews and his subsequent to conquering the Babylonians. It's the first, in that first year, when he was king over not only Persia but also Babylon, he issued this decree to send the Jews home. Who had prophesied? The question is asked, who had prophesied that this would happen? Well, right there in verse 1, it says that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. So the book of Ezra identifies Jeremiah as one who had made such a prophecy. Okay, now, if you're thinking ahead of me, you know that in the Old Testament, Cyrus is actually named as the one who would send the Jews home. But it wasn't Jeremiah who named him. So have we got a potential issue here? Because Ezra 1:1 says Jeremiah issued a prophecy about the Jews, but he's not the one who named Cyrus to do the job. Look with me in Jeremiah 25. This is the prophecy that I think is being referenced here. What did Jeremiah say about the Jews going home? Well, in Jeremiah chapter 25, beginning at verse 8, Therefore thus says the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment and a hissing, a perpetual desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of myrrh and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of millstones and the light of the candle. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it a perpetual desolation. There's what Jeremiah prophesied. He did, it's not that he said Cyrus will do this, but he said it's going to happen after 70 years. After 70 years, so he said, I'm going to send Babylon. I'm going to send Nebuchadnezzar. He's my servant. I'm going to send him. And he's going to conquer all these lands. He's going to conquer Judah. He's going to carry them away captive. And they'll be captive for 70 years. But after 70 years, I'm going to punish Babylon itself. And that's what he did. Because Babylon fell to the Medo-Persian Empire. And the first king, Cyrus / Darius, issued the decree, send the Jews home. Okay? So there's no contradiction here. Jeremiah is the one. What Ezra 1:1 is referring to when it says Jeremiah spoke of this is that Jeremiah spoke of the 70 years, and at the end of the 70 years, Judah would be sent home to rebuild Jerusalem. So that's not a contradiction. Jeremiah certainly did do that. Now I think probably the passage that most of us would think of concerning a very impressive prophetic pronouncement about the return of the Jews is in Isaiah 44. Look at Isaiah 44, beginning verse 24. Thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, and spreadeth abroad the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of the liars, that maketh diviners mad, that turneth wise men backward, and maketh their knowledge foolish, that confirmeth the word of his servants, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah ye shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof, that saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up the rivers, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundations shall be laid. It goes on into the next chapter, 45:1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. He goes on to talk about using Cyrus as his instrument to restore Judah. Skip down to verse 13. I have raised him up in righteousness. I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for prize nor reward, saith the Lord of hosts. And so Isaiah named Cyrus as the one who would do that. And that's really impressive because that's going to happen. Isaiah made that prophecy and named Cyrus almost 200 years before Cyrus was king. And so this is a really impressive bit of prophecy on the part of Isaiah. Ezra doesn't mention that Isaiah had made that prophecy. He mentions what Jeremiah said. So here in Ezra, it mentions Jeremiah had foretold what was about to happen. And what he was referring to was that after 70 years, they'd go home. I don't know why, but it doesn't mention the prophecy of Isaiah that actually named Cyrus as the one who would issue the decree. But that's not a contradiction. It's not a flaw. It's all accurate to what actually happened. Any thoughts or comments on any of this? Sarah?
Another interesting thing is that when he said that he would rebuild the temple, he hadn't even destroyed it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. So, how would he know that? How would he know he's going to rebuild a temple that's still standing there? It's all clearly signs of inspiration. Exactly right. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, so we know who Cyrus is. We know we know this instruction or this decree that he issued to send the Jews home. And we already know that, as we've read, that the captivity lasted for 70 years, according to prophecy. That's amazing to me. That the prophets, before the events even happened, could say, it's going to happen, and here's how long it's going to last. 70 years, think about that. 70 years is a crazy long period of time to be making predictions about political developments in the world. So 70 years ago, in 1952, the Korean War had just wound down. And can you imagine somebody at that time saying that 70 years from now, what? Russia will invade Ukraine. Well, nobody could have made a guess like that. That's crazy. That's ridiculous. Nobody could make a specific historical, political reference in that time frame. Well, Jeremiah did, all right? That he knew how long it would. Actually, it was more than 7. I mean, Isaiah made the prediction before the captivity even began. He made the prediction that it would be 70 years. So it was over 70 years, but he made a prediction of a 70-year period of time, and the captivity would begin and end in that time reference. Really amazing. Monty?
70 years ago, somebody would have said, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. They'd have said, what are you talking about? Russia already has the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So Russia had done fallen since then, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was, more or less, and now they're headed back the other way, maybe. But it would have been a prophecy comparable to this. They'd have been prophesying about something
That hadn't even happened yet.
Just because Russia already on you.
Yeah.
To say this at that time, well, what do you mean rebuild the temple? Ain't even been tore down yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it would have been, to us, we could imagine it would be comparable.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't think, Wade?
Yeah, and it could be, and also too, the way he makes the prophecy. So if somebody said Russia is going to invade Ukraine, but also they're going to form another city inside Ukraine, and it's going to split off. And a general is by the name of
Name him.
Bob, whoever was
Yeah.
going to come. Now that would be something impressive.
Yeah.
But even in the Old Testament, where it talks about I can't remember the name of the city, it's Tyre, I think it was, where they built that thing.
Land bridge, yeah.
Yeah, they said that it was going to be thrown out into the
Ezekiel
sea.
prophesied that.
Yeah. And so, those things are pretty impressive.
Very impressive. Prophecy is really impressive. We probably don't do enough study, what we would refer to as evidence kind of studies based on prophecy, because it's really, really impressive when you tear it all down. And there's lots of.
That would probably be a good study for us.
Yeah, and we have done those kind of. For instance, we've studied the book of Daniel and the very impressive prophecies of Daniel. But probably we don't emphasize it enough when it comes to specifically to this question of evidences and proof that the Bible is inspired. Other thoughts or comments? Okay. So keep reading there, Ezra 1 at verse 4. Whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, this is what Cyrus said. Let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites with all them whose spirit God had raised to go up to build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus says, I'm going to send him back, and God has informed me that he wants his temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. Now, how that happened, we don't know. Notice he said that in verse 2, the God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Now, how that order or instruction from God to Cyrus happened, we don't know. It may have been through a prophet. I think it quite possibly could have been through some prophet who delivered a message. Or maybe a vision. We just don't know. But he very much believed that the God of heaven had given him this charge to send the Jews back to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And so anybody who wants so everybody who's here, everybody who remains, help so let the men of his place help him with silver. So of those who decide they want to be in this party heading back to Jerusalem to rebuild it, the rest of you all jump in here and help and give whatever you can to make this work possible. So he gives the instruction, whoever wants to go is free to go. This is what needs to be done. And whoever's not going, you jump in and help with whatever you can to get the job done. And so then in verse 5, there's an interesting expression in verse 5. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, the priests, the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build the house of the Lord which was in Jerusalem. How do you think that happened? How do you think that God raised the spirits of these who were going to go on this job and assignment? How do you think that happened? Well, I'm not sure again that we could say for sure. Obviously, we're in an age where God was still dealing prophetically and directly through prophets and so forth. And so you couldn't discount the possibility that he directly moved the spirit of certain individuals to be involved in this job. But I think that maybe the more likely possibility is that their spirits were stirred in them simply by the idea that there's a job back in Jerusalem that needs to be done for God. We are his people. We need to do this job. And so they were moved by the proclamation of Cyrus and the need in Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, and their spirits were stirred within them to get involved in this job. I think more than likely that is the explanation as to, you could use the same kind of terminology today. Wayne last year went to Ghana to preach to God. His spirit was stirred in him to take the gospel message to the people in Ghana, in Africa. Well, I'm here to tell you, and Wayne would confirm to us that he didn't get any whisper in his ear or divine revelation telling him that this was a job he should do. He just saw that there was a need and an important opportunity, and he wanted to be involved in that. So, I would think that that'd be a reasonable explanation as to what this means, that their spirit was raised up. Monty, do you have a thought?
I would say that when you think about it, there were prophecies that this captivity was going to happen, that it was going to last 70 years, and these people would have known that. They're being told this, and all of a sudden they know the 70 years is up. Now Cyrus is sending us back. This has got to be something from God, and I'm in a position I can go, I want to do it.
Yeah.
So they could be motivated by fulfilled prophecies.
Yeah.
The Word of God, just like we're motivated today by the Word. Nothing supernatural in our motivation to serve God. It's just the fact that we see the evidences that the Bible is God's Word, and we want to do what it says.
Good point. Yeah, like you said, so here's the person, one of the captives, and he hears Cyrus is decreeing that we can go home. But you know what? They tell me that the prophet Jeremiah so long ago prophesied that at the end of 70 years this would happen. That's amazing. That's got to be God's hand. I'm going to get in on that. I want to be involved in that. I think that could be it for sure. James?
See, like you noted a minute ago, the need was a motivating factor. When we see Nehemiah hears of the condition of Israel or Jerusalem after the fact about the walls, he's upset by just the message that's brought to him from a friend, and he sees the need and is motivated by that word that's brought to him. That same kind of thought.
Yeah.
Words can be a great motivation.
That's exactly right. It wouldn't have to be anything more than just the message that they heard. Exactly right. Wade?
You got to remember, too, people were exiled here. And so this is not favorable conditions for these Jews. So they're obviously wanting to go back to their home where they came from.
Yeah.
So it would be exciting for them to go, oh, we get a chance to go? Yeah, I'm in on it. I'm going,
Yeah. I was reading after one commentator today on this, and some of the exiles were treated pretty nobly, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I mean, they had a pretty cush existence during the Babylonian captivity. But a lot of other exiles did not. And so, as you say, this would have given them, many would have been anxious to go back home. I think you're right. All right, Yancey.
At the end of 2 Chronicles 36, verse 26, and now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia.
Yeah.
So it uses that same terminology here. The Lord
Stirred him up. And again, how exactly he did that, whether by a direct revelation or a dream or a vision, or maybe some prophet went to him and said, you know, you're the guy. Isaiah said, you're the guy. You need, and you know, don't you think that would have been impressive to Cyrus? Wait a minute, that guy named me before I was born. He said I would do that. That might have been the way he was stirred up. We just don't know how that stirring happened, but it did. Okay, good point. All right, so notice how, the things they gave, verse 6, Ezra 1, verse 6. All they that were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, beside all that was willingly offered. And so this became, this was a movement. I think you could call it a movement. There was an excitement. They want to see this happen. And even the ones who are not going are given what they can to make it possible. And then notice what Cyrus gave beginning in verse 7. Also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Mithridah, the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them: 30 chargers of gold, 1,000 chargers of silver, 29 knives, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. These did Sheshbazzar bring with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem. I'm impressed by the fact that for all this time, they had kept inventory of the things that were brought to Babylon out of the temple when they conquered Jerusalem and when they destroyed the temple that Solomon had built and took the precious things. A lot of the precious things were already gone from the temple by the time they conquered Jerusalem, because various kings of Judah had been giving away money, gold and silver and precious things to all sorts of kings around them to appease them, because they were in a bad shape. But there was still considerable wealth left in the temple when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, tore down the temple, and brought these things to Babylon. But isn't it kind of impressive? They kept track of it. They kept an inventory of it. They knew where these vessels had come from and what they were. And Cyrus is giving them back. Clayton.
So this 1,000 silver platters is something that was in the temple? Why would the temple need 1,000 platters?
I don't know. I don't know, but 5,000 such vessels of gold and silver, pretty significant. Pretty significant. I don't know what they would have been used for specifically. What is your name, Monty? I'm trying to call your name and I'm drawing a blank. Monty, go ahead.
I've read that was possibly one of the reasons God didn't allow the Syrians to take Judah, because the Syrians tended to just come in and wipe things out. They cleaned the house, cleaned the plate and everything like that. Where the Babylonians tended to preserve certain things like this and to keep up with it. And so that was an advantage, because like the records in the temple of the genealogies would have been preserved and things like that under the Babylonians, where they wouldn't have been under the Assyrians. And so that was through God's providence or planning. That's why he allowed the Babylonians to take Judah as opposed to the Assyrians, so that this could be maintained.
That's an interesting point, because we're going to see here in the next chapter that they still had their genealogical records, and they could confirm who was who and what their lineage was. We'll see that here. That's a good point. So that had been preserved as well. Wait.
Yeah, so a couple things, but if you remember when Hezekiah was king, he actually showed the Babylonians around in his palace and before they came and overtook it. So he was bragging about,
and Isaiah told them,
yeah,
you shouldn't have done that.
He was bragging about all this stuff. But one of the kings I remember and I can't remember who it was, that raided Jerusalem and stole the shields. I think they were bronze shields that Solomon had made. and then they went back and redid them and made them, was it copper? Or maybe it was gold shields and they made them bronze?
That's what I think, yeah.
So, yeah.
So a lot of the wealth of Jerusalem had been robbed and given away over many
And so
years.
you think that probably some of these, whatever they were, that were bronze, that were given into the temple, they probably took those and melted them down and made those shields from.
Yeah, I just don't know. I don't know. But again, I do think it's a point of emphasis. There was still a reasonable, considerable amount of wealth when Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, and he carried it to Babylon, and they kept up with it, and they kept record of it. Now Cyrus is sending it back. Now, got another identity crisis here to try and work through. Who is this Sheshbazzar? He's mentioned there in verse 11. In fact, in verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8, he's called the Prince of Judah. He's mentioned in verse 11 that he was given charge of these items to be sent back. Look in chapter 5 at verse 14, Ezra 5:14. Ezra 5:14 says, "The vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, and brought them into the temple of Babylon, those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor, and said to him, take these vessels, go carry them to the temple that is in Jerusalem, let the house of God be builded in that place." So Sheshbazzar is called the governor of the returning peoples and the land of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. But then look in chapter 3 at verse 8. Chapter 3, verse 8. "Now in the second year of their coming into the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month began Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak, and the remnant of their brethren, and the priests and Levites, and all they that came out of the captivity of Jerusalem, appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to set forward the work of the house of the Lord." You know, when we talk about this first return of exiles, we almost, and I don't know of any exception to this, we always say that the first group of exiles was led back by Zerubbabel. Well, who's this Sheshbazzar anyway? And it even calls him the governor, an appointed governor by Cyrus. Well, again, a couple of explanations are possible. You remember, whenever we're faced with a potential contradiction, we only have to have one reasonable explanation to dissolve the apparent contradiction. A lot of people think that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, same person, because they're identified as having the same work, the same roles, basically. And so I think there's a real high probability that it's two names of the same guy. Again, men identified by two different names is common in this time of the Bible. And so that would not be a surprise that while we have just two names of the same individual, two different names. The difference here, I mentioned earlier, remember Daniel was given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were actually Babylonian names, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. That's where their Hebrew names. And I never understood why did Daniel go by his Hebrew name, not his Babylonian name. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went by their Babylonian names and not their Hebrew names primarily. I don't know why that was, but they had two names. The problem here is that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are both Babylonian names. They're both of Babylonian origin. So that doesn't help our explanation. It doesn't destroy it, but it doesn't help our explanation in knowing that those are both Babylonish names. Wait.
In verse 8 here, when he identifies him as Prince of Judah, do you think that means he was a prince from the kings of Judah, or do you think he was a prince named by Cyrus?
Well, there's a tie-in, and I don't know if you noticed there's some references in our study guide to some genealogy, and 1 Chronicles 3, 17 through 19, that talks about the descendants of Jeconiah. And maybe there's a tie-in there as to why he would be considered a prince, that he is a descendant of the later kings in Judah, maybe. I read after one other guy who offered an explanation. I don't know where you would even go to try to confirm this. That this I'm having trouble saying it. Sheshbazzar was maybe like the official assigned the job, and Zerubbabel was his deputy who actually went to do the work. He was like the job superintendent. I don't know where you'd come up with that. But again, I think for our purposes primarily, this is not considered to be some kind of terrible contradiction, unresolved contradiction. I think the easiest explanation is likely that it's the same man with two different names. Sarah?
Zerubbabel was listed in the genealogy of Christ.
Yeah.
So he would have been a descendant of David.
And a descendant of Jeconiah, too. Jeconiah was in the lineage of Christ. Exactly right.
They laid the foundation and they just worked on it.
Yeah, after they got started, they quit until Ezra came along and stirred them up later. Sheshbazzar.
He's the one who laid the foundation.
Yeah.
Instead of verse 16.
Yeah. I'm pretty much inclined to the same person. Wayne.
Another thing that may help us identify who Sheshbazzar was is in chapter 3, in verse 8, 9, and 10. Now, the second year of the coming of the house of the God of Jerusalem, the second month, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the brothers and the priests and the Levites and all who came to captivity to Jerusalem began the work and appointed the Levites from 24 years and older. And then, skipping verse 10, and they started building the house, laying the foundation of the house of the Lord. Now, if you skip over to chapter 5,
it says that Sheshbazzar did that.
Sheshbazzar,
They're credited with the same activity and the same assignment. And so that, I think, lends to the fact that they're the same individual. I think you're right. Anybody else? Okay, again, I mean, and again, somebody might try to throw that up as a potential contradiction. I don't think it is. I don't think it can be sustained. Real quickly before we run out of time, how many Jews returned to Palestine from Babylon in that first group in 516 BC? Remember, 516 is dated, by the way, from 586 when Jerusalem was conquered and the temple destroyed. So here's your 70 years. 516 in chapter 2. Before we get to that, chapter 2. And if anybody wants to volunteer to read chapter 2 aloud to us, we'll let you start now. See if you can get done before class is over and pronouncing all those names. Kristen says Josh should do it. Why are all those names there? What advantage do we have by all these names of people who were involved who went back? Monty.
First thing we got to consider is this wasn't written to me. It was written for the Jewish people, and they would have recognized these people as we talked about from their genealogies and things like that. So it had been a personal thing to them, they would have understood. And I think another thing, it tells us that God's aware of who does what.
Yeah.
And He had it written down, and it tells us that God knows what we do. He knew what these people did individually. He knows what we do individually. And it helps us to identify, I think, is to know that we've got to give an accounting for our actions.
I think to me, that's the big point right there, Monty. And we'll see this again and again. We'll see it in Nehemiah, where different individuals are named and what work they did in rebuilding the walls. And, you think, well, why do I need to know those individual names? What I need to know is what Monty just said, that God is aware. If He knows your name, and He knows what you do. And He can document that to minutest detail. And so that's a comforting thought, to know that God knows us by names and is aware of our lives and what we're dealing with. It's also a potentially scary thing to know that He knows us that well, and therefore we better be make our best effort to serve Him faithfully, because He knows when we fail too. So anyway, okay. So how many were there? Look in chapter 2, verse 64. Chapter 2, verse 64. It says the whole congregation together was 42,303 score. So 42,360 went back. That wasn't nearly all who left. I'm convinced that many of those who were initially carried away into captivity died in that time. Daniel was a young man when that happened, when the captivity began. He was an old man, still alive, still serving as a statesman under Darius the Mede. But he was an old man by that point in time. He would have had to have been, in his late 80s or maybe 90 by that time. So most of the people, I'd just say this, a lot of the people who were taken captivity no doubt died during the captivity. Some came back. There were enough that came back that when they got the temple done and the old timers saw the temple and compared it to what they remembered from Solomon's temple, they cried over it because it was so lacking by comparison. But again, a lot of the people who left in captivity did not come back from the captivity. Some did. But of the exiles who came back, 42,360. Wait.
Did you notice the difference between the animals that they brought back? 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, 6,720 donkeys. They used a lot of donkeys back then, apparently.
Yeah. Beast of burden. And so they were carrying back a lot of things with them to do this work. Yeah, no doubt. Okay, let's skip down to. Yes, this was just the first wave.
Just as they were taken into captivity at three different times,
Yeah.
3 different deportations, they were restored back to their land in 3 different.
Exactly right. Sometimes when we're quizzing the kids in the drill class up here, we'll say, who led the first group back? Zerubbabel. Who led the second group back? Ezra. Who led the third group back? Nehemiah. So as Wayne says, there were 3 waves of return. We're just talking about the very first of them here. Exactly right. Look in chapter 2 at verse 59. These were they which went up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, Immer, but they could not show their father's house and their seed, whether they were of Israel. So some of them who went back couldn't verify their lineage, and therefore they were excluded. Look at verse 62. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they, as polluted, put from the priesthood. Some even wanted to believe that they were qualified to serve as Levitical priests, but they couldn't prove it. And so they were not allowed to do so. But this goes to a point we were making earlier. Part of what was preserved when Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem, not only the vessels of the house of God, but also the genealogical records were preserved. Now you think about that. You think about how important that was. That was critically important. Why? Well, we got to prove that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David. We got to be able to prove who Jesus is in his genealogies going back. And so it was critically important. I mean, what's the likelihood? What do you think the likelihood is? We're out of time. Russia's invading Ukraine. What do you think the likelihood is that they're worried at all about keeping the birth records at the hospitals they're blowing up? I think not at all. Right? That doesn't seem like what a conquering king would do, but he did. And providentially, it was absolutely necessary. Servants came back. According to chapter 2, verse 65, in addition to the Jews who came back, they brought back with them servants, 7,337, according to chapter 2, verse 65. Beast of burden that Wade mentioned. And some Nethinims came back with them. And they're mentioned in Ezra 8, verse 20, that there were some Nethinims who came back. Who were the Nethinims? Well, they were servants. And they're named in the Old Testament in several places. We don't know for sure, but a lot of people think that the Nethinims that would have come back with the Jews from Babylonian captivity were potentially descendants of the Gibeonites in the days of Joshua. You remember the Gibeonites were the ones who tricked Joshua. You know, they wore old, worn-out clothes and brought moldy bread. And they said, "Hey, we've come from way far away." When actually they came from the next town over. And Joshua and the people of Israel were tricked into making a treaty with them, and they weren't supposed to. And when they found out they'd been tricked, they said, "Okay, but you will be servants and burden bearers from now on forever." And some people think that these special servants, identified as Nethinim here in Ezra, might have been the long-range descendants of those Gibeonites who tricked Joshua and the children of Israel. So we got things rolling. The process is beginning. We'll continue our study next week, Lord willing.